Nick, my boyfriend, was born in Kinsley. However, he moved to my city last year where we met. A few months into the relationship, he suggested we go visit his mom, his only living parent, in Kinsley. I was very much in love with him by then and ecstatic that he wanted me to meet his mom. So I traveled with him, and I thank my lucky stars that I lived to tell my experiences of the Festival of Crows. Let me start at the beginning. For me, it began at a pothole on the road connecting Kings Cove to the mainland. I was dozing when the car plummeted into a pothole so deep I thought for a second we were falling into the bowels of the earth. I screamed, gripping Nick's arm tightly. He swerved. "Lucille," he cried, dragging the car back across the gravel of the road's shoulder, which dropped down into the ocean far below. The road connecting Kings Cove Peninsula, Nick's childhood home, was narrow and elevated far above the sparkling waves. I felt my face flush, ashamed of my overreaction, but Nick was smiling. God damn it, same as last year and the year before. Are they never going to fix that road? Like a bloody chasm, worse every year. He let his hand drift on my thigh. "I'm sorry you were startled, darling," he continued. "It's so typical. The mainlanders simply don't care about the peninsula. On the mainland, you get construction crews working round the clock to fix every tiny thing, but out here, they just don't care." I nodded. I had heard him rant about Kings Cove being badly neglected over the past decades, services falling apart. The main township of Kinsley, Nick's family home, was a 3-hour drive from the causeway that connected the peninsula to the mainland. From the city where we lived, it was another 2-hour drive. We had been on the road since 7 in the morning, and we were just about to drive onto the causeway. A rusted green sign held the faded words, "We come to Kings Cove." I was puzzled over what that could mean, and it was only after we drove by that I realized the letter L in the sign had faded. "Isn't it beautiful?" Nick was smiling broadly now. "Almost worth the rural technology." The ocean ran up to the bottom of the elevated causeway on both sides, an incredible deep blue stretching out for miles, patterned by waves and edged by hazy cliffs and hills covered with fresh green foliage. "It's lovely, Nick," I said. I gazed at the sky where 2 birds, barely visible specks in the air, were circling. "Are they eagles?" I naively asked, pointing. Nick took his eyes off the road as he followed the direction of my finger. For the first time I understood the phrase, "turned pale with fear." Nick's color drained so quickly I feared he would faint dead. I grabbed the wheel. It wasn't necessary, for he silently steadied himself and exited the causeway, pulling the car onto the gravel shoulder. Without a word, he got out and stared at the soaring birds. "Nick?" He didn't answer. I got out of the car and went up to him. "Nick?" His neck tilted back. He muttered something. "What, darling?" The wind and waves made it hard to hear. "Those aren't eagles," he said dazedly. "Okay, sweetheart." I could feel my stomach start to knot. He was never like this. "I didn't realize they're so far out. They never come this far." The birds swooped down, seemingly towards the ground. They were black, much smaller than eagles. Nick shrieked, sprinted, grabbed my hand, and dragged us back towards the car. "Lucille, get in. We need to get home." We jumped in the car, and he blasted off towards the interior of the peninsula and the town of Kinsley. I looked back. 2 large crows had perched where we had been standing moments ago. I looked at Nick. His profile jutted sharply towards the windshield, his mouth set in a hard line, his hands gripping the wheel. He almost looked like a different person. He glanced at the rearview mirror and pressed on the gas even harder. "Nick, you're way over the speed limit. Calm down, darling. What is it?" My voice seemed to break the spell. His face and hands relaxed. He glanced sideways at me and smiled. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I didn't mean to scare you." "But what is it? The birds?" He smiled wanly. "It's nothing, Lucille." His voice faded. The sun shone on the blue vastness on my side. "It's nothing. Remember the silly photos I showed you of my childhood dressed up with my Aunt Margaret, and the news clips? How we celebrate the Parade of Crows each year?" I nodded. "Yes, you just said it's an old local festival, right?" He smiled again. A quick sly smile I didn't like. "Yes, actually, you must be right." He sounded forced and jovial. "It is this weekend. You'll probably catch it. I completely forgot. That's okay, right? You love these bits and bobs of culture." "But you didn't tell me it was this weekend. You said the kids dress up as crows and birds?" "Yes, and it's actually not that old. It started back in the early 2000s when I was a kid, just for fun. But then it really ramped up during the COVID pandemic of 2020, you know. I shook my head, feeling even more confused. Was he talking about the COVID pandemic? I decided to keep quiet, and he started in a chatty voice. Oh, I'd be surprised if there is even anything happening. It was just a fun little thing to do with a few families. There wasn't much going on, you know, during the pandemic. Just dressing up and learning about wildlife, you know, homeschooling, arts and crafts. It was the pandemic. I didn't say anything. I really wanted him to stop talking about the pandemic. I wanted to put all that behind me. Everybody just had a shitty time, right? The dilapidated road worsened as we neared the township of Kinsley. We passed houses set a good distance back from the road. In a rocky meadow, a group of children were working with large pieces of black fabric. Nick braked and pulled over. Oh look, I think that's my cousin's kids, Steve, and who was it? Shall we go and say hi? Before waiting for my answer, he jumped out and headed towards them. I got out and followed him. There were 3 children on the grass, a small blonde girl and 2 older boys. They were messing around with black and orange paper, fabric, and scissors. The girl folded a circle of orange paper into a cone and put it over her face, covering her nose and mouth. A mask, she said solemnly. Louisa, you need to put in the lines for the beaks, said one of the boys. Louisa didn't say anything. I looked at Nick, who was staring at them with shining eyes. Nick, what are they doing? He didn't seem to hear me. He crouched down and said to the older boy, Hey Steve, it's me, Nick. You remember me, buddy? How's your mom? Aren't you going to use any feathers? I always had tons of feathers on my costumes. Steve didn't look up. I looked back. A third boy was approaching across the meadow, carrying a black object in his outstretched palms. As he came closer, I saw it was a dead crow, its claws pointing upward. Nick? I said, tugging his sleeve. He didn't respond. The sun was shining very brightly, but the ocean noises were very distant. The other 3 children laid down their little scissors and glue sticks and clustered in a small semicircle around the boy. Louisa still held the cone over her face. Then they looked up at us for the first time, expectantly. I held on to Nick's sleeve. He took a step but then stopped. The kids frowned and moved closer together, closing the circle. Nick, I cried loudly, let's go. I pulled his arm, but Nick brought up his other arm across my body. Lucille, it's tradition, he said it quietly. Then he looked at me, smiling warmly. Isn't it interesting? The children are making their costumes for the festival. Isn't it cool? Please let's go, Nick, I pleaded. The children were paying us no attention, their little fingers busily cutting paper and gluing feathers. The dead crow was lying by a rock. Oh, sweetheart, you must be tired. Don't mind the kids just fooling around, you know. We're only 5 minutes from my mom's place now. Come on, she is dying to meet you. I silently followed him to the car, and we drove the rest of the way, barely exchanging another word. A woman was waiting at the door of the house, waving at us. I had video chatted with Nick's mom, Violet, before, and she told me how pleased she would be to welcome me to their home over the weekend. Rural connectivity and technology being what it was, our chats never lasted long, but I knew her as a warm, friendly woman. And now, seeing her in the flesh confirmed that impression. A petite, beaming woman with Nick's finely etched features, she ran up to the car. Oh my goodness, I thought you two would never get here. I was starting to get worried. You shouldn't have been worried, Mom, said Nick grumpily. You could have always called, and we saw Steve and Louisa on the way and stopped to say hi. Anyway, here's Lucille. Oh, really? Yelped Violet. It seemed she forgot about me as she fixed her eyes on her son's face. And what were Steve and his little friends up to now? Nick hauled my overnighter from the back. Oh, you know, starting on their costumes. I totally forgot about that old feast, festival, whatever it was. Do people still do that here? God, they must be bored. His tone sounded strange, and I gave him a quick look. Although his eyes were hooded, that sly, sneaky smile I had noticed earlier flashed around his lips. It seemed as if both Violet and Nick had frozen in the early afternoon sun. I looked up at the house, a small unkempt building with the wooden deck and terrace in need of paint. Nick's father had passed just before Nick moved to the city. I think he had died right at the start of the first wave of the pandemic. A harsh cawing broke the spell. Violet and Nick jerked their heads upward and backward, looking towards the far end of the front garden where a few crows were flapping their dark wings, etched against the blue spring sky. "There's so many of them this year," murmured Violet. "I know. We saw some as far out as the causeway," replied Nick. Violet's eyes widened so I could see the whites of her eyes as she snapped her head towards Nick. "What? By the causeway? Oh, no, no, no." She covered her face with her hands, moaning. "Nick," I cried, "what's wrong?" The sound of my voice again seemed to jolt things back to normal. Violet straightened up, removing her hands. She beamed at me. "Look at us, yammering on with this lovely young thing standing here. Never mind our silly country ways, my dear. You come on right in. I was sure you'd be hungry after that long drive, so I have all sorts of snacks ready for you. Our farmer's market here is to die for. Have you ever had rose marmalade? I bet you will be taking at least 5 jars back with you. The crow's marmalade here is famous. Lucky for you, it's on all this weekend. Usually, it's just Saturday mornings, you know." I wondered if she was prone to little verbal twitches like crows for Rose as she led me in, Nick following. The table was set as she had promised, with lovely foods, marmalades and jams winking in pretty china platters, fresh-baked country bread with gleaming pats of butter, and carefully arranged slices of cold meats and cheese. An hour flew by delightfully as we ate. Violet was very pleasant, asking about my family and job in the city. Finally, I stood up, quite full. Nick smiled at me. "Want to go for a little stretch your legs? I can show you something of the town. We're barely 2 minutes away from downtown. Mom, are you coming?" Violet laughed. "That's the advantage of these places, dear. Not like your big cities. Everything is 2 minutes away from everything else. You two go ahead and enjoy yourselves. I'll clear up." The little downtown was lined with cute Victorian-style buildings, probably the newest additions to Kinsley. People were hanging banners and bird and feather cutouts in black, orange, and blue for the start of tomorrow's festival. The colors would have felt more Halloween-y, but for the warm sun, the green-laced blooming trees of spring, and the not-so-distant rumble of the ocean. I didn't ask about the festival. I was happy to let it drop, and Nick seemed oblivious to the activity. He stopped at the local antique shop, and I wandered down the street looking for a cafe. At the edge of the town, I noticed a faint footpath leading directly into a shady gap in the tree line. Idly, and without thinking, I followed the path for a few minutes before noticing black feathers scattered along it. The sun, the unaccustomed food, and the fresh ocean air seemed to have addled my brains. I kept walking in a daze, noticing but not properly looking at the increasing piles of black feathers. The woodsy air was cool after the sun of the open streets. Like Hansel following his trail, I just moved forward, and then the path abruptly stopped before a large open field. I blinked in the sudden flood of sunlight. At the far end of the field I saw 3 poles, each topped by a human-sized figure held up by their overstretched arms, their heads slumped forward and sideways. For a minute I panicked. Various images from stories and legends tumbled into my brain. Jesus on a cross. No, he was naked. These figures were fully clothed with straws poking out of their sleeves, pant legs, and hats, making sharp lines against the thin blue of the sky. Straw hay. Oh, that old movie, The Lion, the girl dancing and singing in red shiny shoes, the Green Witch. They were scarecrows. I still remember the sudden jolt of recognition my brain received. I still see those scarecrows in my nightmares hanging there forlornly until they start to twitch. But I won't spoil the story for you. A tall figure and a few children dressed in black were standing near the 3 poles, looking up at the figures. I went closer. I could see the corpse-like wizened figures covered in dried black tar and tied to scarecrow poles with ropes around their arms and feet. As I watched, the children began throwing handfuls of feathers into the air, aiming vaguely for the figures, chanting. 2 of the children seemed to have deformed faces. The man took an axe and started chopping apart the legs of the figure on the pole closest to me. I opened my mouth, then closed it again, holding in a scream. A crow cawed. The man and children whipped around and saw me. The man strode towards me, still holding the tar-smeared axe. He started shouting. He was speaking with a strong local accent, but I could pick up what he was saying. He was not happy to see me and wanted me gone. He accused me of spying for the government. The children stared silently. and I noticed the two children that I had thought had deformed faces actually had the same orange beak masks tied on, like the little girl from the roadside I had seen earlier. I took a step back on the path that had led me to this field as he drew closer. He yelled, "And tell your government masters," while raising his axe. I am almost sure he didn't mean to hurt me, just scare me, when he dropped the axe, and a white grin broke out on his tar-besmirched face. It was even more disturbing than the tirade. He called out, "Nick!" Nick had emerged from the woods behind me. "Craig," he replied, "you met Lucille already?" They ran up to each other and made as if to hug, but didn't, sidestepping awkwardly. Craig smiled at me. "I'm afraid I gave her quite a scare," he said, his voice now clear and almost accent-free. "I thought she was a trespasser and wanted to warn her off, rather me than Farmer Bill." They looked at each other and burst out laughing at some shared memory. I stood there feeling like a fool. I looked down at one of the masked children. "Are you pretending to be a crow?" I asked awkwardly. The girl made a harsh cawing sound in response and ran away back to where the scarecrows were dangling. Somehow I felt that was the last straw. Looking at Nick, now deep in quiet conversation with Craig, I announced loudly, "I'm going back to the house," and turned and went back down the wooded path, down the main town street I had been perhaps 30 minutes before. I found my way easily enough back to Nick's house, despite the spotty signal on my phone. Violet was in the kitchen. "Back so soon," she cried. "Where's Nick? Don't tell me you had a lover's quarrel already." She giggled. "No, of course not." I couldn't help sounding snappy. She stopped giggling and looked at me with worried eyes. "Oh, my dear, are you okay? I suppose Kinsley is a lot to take in for a visitor from a big city." I knew I was being rude. "Honestly, Violet, our city isn't that big, and Kinsley is perfectly lovely. I'm just a bit tired, and Nick ran into an old friend. Craig, I think. And if I could lie down," Violet cried. "Yes, of course, dear. Your bedroom is made up for you, and I wouldn't worry about Craig. A lovely boy, my poor sister Margaret's son, so fond of Nick. Quite upset when he decided to leave for the city last year." She continued chatting as she made her way down the hall with me following. "The Corvid stuff got to him a bit. Well, it did everyone, I suppose. But Craig never readjusted properly like Nick, and all the children. The schooling. So hard. You know, not socializing and playing properly like children are supposed to, and us women had to do all of it, although poor Margaret. And they never reopened the schools fully anyway. Not enough funding for teachers and assistants, they said. What kind of government won't fund schools? I don't suppose Corvid made that much of an impact on you being in a big city with all the amenities." The uneasy fear came surging back. "COVID. Violet, you mean COVID. A couple of years ago, right?" I said, cutting her midstream. Violet laughed. "Well, we must all have our little jokes, dear. Just lightens the load, right? Now here's your room. You rest up, and maybe this evening we can play some games. Wouldn't that be fun?" She turned and left, closing the door behind her. I flopped heavily on the pretty floral bed, breathing, trying to regain my calm. I opened my eyes. I was on the bed in the bedroom Violet had showed me to. A large, black-feathered, beaked face pushed itself into me. I screamed and then woke up, my body jolting in fear. Nick pulled off the bird mask, laughing. "Oh my God, Lucille, the look on your face. It's just a silly mask. Look, I made it when I was a child." A wave of anger surged in me, but some hidden survival instinct kept me calm. Instead, I smiled at Nick and said brightly, "That's pretty neat. People here are so creative. I had no idea." Nick looked at me silently, his hands busily stroking the black feathers. Then he returned my smile. "Oh, Lucille," he said, the relief palpable in his voice. "I'm so glad you appreciate it. Outsiders have no idea, you know, the talent and the energy here, on the peninsula. And you know, it's crazy, but the pandemic really brought it out. I was in my last year of high school, you know, so I helped my Aunt Margaret and others with homeschooling. We used to say the pandemic was the best thing that had happened to us. So much artistry, communion with nature. Little kids talking to the crows, the scarecrows." His voice trailed off. I said nothing. He picked up again. "And then my dad died, and Aunt Margaret, and Craig was just too much. I felt I had to get away, you know. I was feeling overwhelmed, and my mom supported me to get off the peninsula, even though the others didn't want me to." I gently prompted, "Your mom sounds amazing." He eagerly responded, "Oh, she is. You have no idea." His voice brightened as he continued, "Let's go down. She's made the most beautiful supper for us." The rest of the evening passed smoothly. Nick was his usual loving self, and Violet was charming. We ate together, helped with chores, and even played a round of rummy. Then Violet went to bed, and we turned in shortly afterward. We made love, and I forgot all my worries in the deep delight of true love. Afterward, I fell into an excellent sleep. In the morning, I woke up to an empty bed. I went down where Violet laughed at me. "Good morning, sleepyhead. Nick already went to town to catch up with his old friends. I'm sure if you follow, you'll run into him at the coffee shop or antique store." Despite her friendliness, I sensed she wanted me out of her way. So I said I'd go look for him and grab breakfast in town. I texted him, but my message remained unread. I felt more accustomed to the town's vibes now, and seeing the children crouched in corners by decorated poles, some dressed up in black feathers and wings, but some not, didn't bother me. Some of them pecked at the ground, pretending to eat, while others ran around flapping their black wings. I smiled at them and hurried on, eager to see Nick and feeling hungry. I sent him another text. A girl bumped into me. I recognized her from the day before. She didn't have the beak and crow costume on. I smiled at her and she said, "You're Nick's girlfriend from off the peninsula, aren't you?" "Yes," I replied. "And you're Louisa, right? You're not wearing your costume today." "I hate the stupid mask and costume. I can't breathe when I'm masked," she said angrily. I was surprised. "Well, I'm sure you don't have to wear it, right? Or maybe just wear the wings and not the beaks." She frowned. "Everyone has to wear masks, or we'll kill the old ones and then die ourselves. Didn't they tell you that? Didn't you have to wear masks off the peninsula?" I shook my head, the feeling of helpless confusion coming over me again. I said cautiously, "I meant the bird masks. Are you talking about the pandemic? The pandemic is over." Louisa opened her eyes wide. Suddenly her expression changed to pure terror, crying, "No, no, no, no!" She rushed past me. I looked back. Craig was standing in the middle of the street holding a cat high by its scruff. "I caught this one attacking the crows, Louisa. That won't do, you know. We can't have that here. It has to go," he cried. Louisa screamed loudly, and people began gathering. The cat was a beautiful big golden tabby, its fur glowing in the morning sun. It kept quite still. "Craig!" screamed Louisa. "Please no. I'll keep her indoors. Don't harm her. Give her to me." She reached up for her tabby. A man held Louisa back. "If it attacked crows on festival day, that's bad, Louisa. Let Craig do what he does and protect them. You can get another cat." Another cried, "Back off, Louisa." Craig raised his other hand to the tabby's neck. Without thinking, I ran forward, my handbag raised, and hit him square in his chest. The blow took him by surprise. He staggered back and dropped the cat. Louisa scooped her up and ran off. The crowd parted for her. Craig squared up to me. "How dare!" He raised his hand. I looked around. The crowd seemed to have vanished. The street was empty. I shrank back, waiting for the blow. There was no use in running. Where would I run to? "Lucille." "Craig, what's going on?" Nick ran out of a shop. Craig dropped his hand. "Nick, what the hell were you thinking bringing her here?" he cried. "She interrupted me. You know she can't do that. She doesn't understand our ways." Nick stared at him. "Craig, are you still into that old stuff with crows? Let it drop, cousin. The pandemic is over." Craig strode toward him. "Corvid is not over. My mother is dead, Nick, and your father too. What is wrong with you? The crows are here. They need their sacrifice," he screamed. I stared at the two men squaring up to each other in horror and began shrinking back into a crevice between two buildings. As I noticed people coming back into the street, I heard their mutters. "He's right, Nick. That's what the townies say, but we know better. Corvid isn't over. They need their sacrifice. You're worse than she is. She's just ignorant, but you know better." I stepped back deeper into the crevice and crouched behind a garbage bin. From there, I watched as in slow motion, the townspeople led by Craig overpower Nick and take him away. It happened so fast. Within minutes, the street was empty. The shops shuttered. I stepped out of my hiding place and with tears streaming down my face, ran back toward Nick's house, not knowing what to do or whether I should even tell Violet. In my confusion and terror, I took the wrong turn, and I ended up by craggy rocks by the ocean. My phone had no reception. The crashing waves, the loneliness, the high soaring white seagulls gave me comfort. After all the nonsense with the black crows, the seagulls minding their own business were delightful. and I found myself lying back on a rock, letting myself be soothed by the sound of their calls, the waves, and their looping flights. I know I should get up, find help, find Violet, but I simply didn't want to. Hours passed. Looking back, my irrational decision to stay in the rocks saved me. By following my survival instinct and remaining hidden from view in the dips of the rocks, I lived. But eventually, propelled by hunger and my body aching from prolonged contact with the chilly damp rocks, I had to get up and leave the shelter of the ocean. I walked back toward the town. As disoriented as I was, I figured out my way and soon spotted Nick's house. It was already early afternoon. I was pleased to see our car waiting patiently in the driveway. The front door swung open, and for a moment I foolishly expected to see Violet standing there smiling, holding a tray of crow's jam and fresh-baked muffins. Crow's jam? Was I becoming one of them? I shook my head as I bounded up the steps. "Violet!" I called through the open door. There was no answer. I went inside. Of course, you know a house is empty as soon as you set foot in it. I called out a couple more times, moving from room to room. In the kitchen, I noticed the signs of the struggle. The overturned bowl of dough, the trail of flour, broken glassware. They must have taken her from here. I picked up the landline. No reception. I desperately punched 911 into my cell again. No use. I went upstairs looking for the car keys, and then I picked up a journal lying on the nightstand and, despite the sense of urgency, couldn't help reading. April 5th, 2020. Aunt Margaret says we should do something better with the Crows Festival this year, distract the kids. It feels like everyone is going crazy, and I think that's a cool idea. Craig said he would help to make it really fun. April 10th, 2020. Everybody is fighting. I hate this. Dad says holding a big festival would be breaking the COVID rules, even though it's outdoors. I'm almost 19 now, and I'm still stuck at home and have to listen to Dad. He yelled at Aunt Margaret and Craig during our family Zoom happy hour and told them they were irresponsible with the kids. I can't wait to leave this town. I wish Mom would leave too. I continued reading with growing horror. Nick's dad died in May that year, not of COVID as I had assumed. His body was found in a field, tied to a pole with his arms outstretched, covered in tar and black crow feathers. The cause of death was never determined. 3 months later, Aunt Margaret had died, this time of COVID, so Nick wrote. From the road, I heard a car passing and stayed low, making sure I couldn't be seen in the windows by anyone driving by. There wasn't anything else here for me, and I opened the door to the backyard, and then I saw it. Violet's corpse hanging from a thick rope tied to the eaves above the door. Blood from her cut throat had soaked the rope and pooled beneath her. The smell hit hard. My stomach knotted as I fought the urge to throw up. I still thought I could find Nick and leave together. By some miracle, the car keys were left hanging where Nick had left them the night before. I snatched them and made my way gingerly around Violet's dangling body. The smell of congealing blood pooled by her feet filled my nostrils. They must have killed her while I was hiding in the rocks. I ran to the car and jumped in, trying to think if I should go find Nick. As I hesitated at the lane, not sure whether to turn towards the highway leading out of Kinsley or towards the interior of this damn town for a desperate attempt to find my lover, I heard a loud meow from inside the car. I shrieked and turned back. Louisa sat up, pulling away my jacket that she had been hiding under, holding her beautiful golden cat. "Take me with you," she said. "I don't want to stay here. Craig will kill her. You saw for yourself." "Your parents?" Her eyes filled up. "My mom died. They said it was Corvid, but I know it was Craig. He killed her because she left the peninsula just for a day to visit Grandma. She wasn't from Kinsley, you know, and they just always hated her here. Craig said she broke the rules and brought Corvid back and had to die. She wasn't even ill, and Dad was too scared to do anything. I hate him." How could I tell this scared child to get out of my car? "Okay, Louisa, you can come, but tell me, do you have any idea where they might have taken Nick? He's probably tied up in the field. You know, where we all were yesterday. He's been tar and feathered, and they'll kill him later." "So he's still alive?" Louisa shrugs. "Probably. They sacrifice before sunset when the birds are most active." I couldn't hesitate any longer. How could I live with myself knowing I had left Nick to a terrible death? I turned the car towards the fields and Tabby meowed loudly again. Louisa guided me, and soon the scarecrow came into sight. I cried out at the unrecognizable figure of what was Nick, covered with black lumps of tar and feathers. The tar has already cooled, but I know it was hot when they first flung gobs of it at his body, from the nasty burst blisters dotting his skin where it was exposed. The feathers dangled crookedly in odd angles. The sun was low. Louisa told me to stop behind some bushes. On the other side, the scarecrow pole was almost close enough to touch. I got out of the car and without thinking called out, "Nick!" He twitched in response. Louisa from inside the car cried, "What are you doing? You can't help him now." As if to prove her point, a shout went up. And then I saw the children at the feet of the scarecrow pole, all costumed in black, wearing beaked orange masks. They started shouting and pointing at me. In response, yelling came from the far part of the field. Adults were running towards us. I looked straight up at Nick. Maybe I'm imagining this to absolve myself, but I swear I saw his mouth move through the feathers stuck on his face. "Go, please go." Louisa was frantic now. The children were trying to push through the bushes to get us as the adults arrived. Tears streaming down my face, I jumped into the car and started driving. Don't stop, please just drive, they'll cut you off," cried Louisa. I didn't stop. The sun dipped lower. We were only a few minutes from the highway, the ocean lying peacefully in the late afternoon ahead of us, and I thought we were almost out when my heart sank. From a fork in a road, a stream of people started pouring out in front, effectively blocking our way, and behind the crowd I spotted a police car. Instinctively, I slowed down. "No, no, no!" screamed Louisa. "Please, no, not now!" And then it happened. I don't understand. I can't pretend to know why. My therapist has implied I might have been hallucinating from fear and hunger at that point, but she is wrong. It happened. Black clouds of crows rose from the trees behind me and dove straight towards the crowd blocking us. The cawing was deafening. I came to a full stop and Louisa stopped screaming. We watched silently as hundreds of crows, darkening the sky and the road and ocean, flew at the crowd. People started screaming and running. The road cleared. I didn't hesitate any longer. Pressing my foot on the gas as hard as I could, the engine roared into life, and we shot down the road. Outside was a mass of black wings, screaming bleeding faces, flying hair, and flailing arms, but I kept my eyes straight ahead. Within seconds, we drove off the last peninsula road and onto the highway. I kept my speed. I glanced in the rear-view mirror. No one was following us. All that could be seen was a dark mass of shrieking humans and cawing crows. The sun dipped lower. The crows rose high. I drove non-stop for 2 hours. Gradually, the highway became more populated with cars. I caught sight of gas stations and chain coffee shops. Louisa had fallen asleep and Tabby purred at me. I was interviewed by the police later, many times. I told my therapist that I felt they were blaming me for not trying harder to save Nick, who died not long after we left Kinsley. She says that is my own guilt. Louisa and Tabby went to live with her mother's family. I've visited her once since, and she doesn't seem to remember Kinsley much. I go back to the window and look out. It's dark now, but I know the crows are still there watching over me. But my story is done.